Good day. Our report for today is about euthanasia. What is euthanasia? Euthanasia refers to deliberately ending someone's life, usually to relieve suffering. Doctors sometimes perform euthanasia when it's requested by people who have a terminal illness and are in a lot of pain. It's a complex process and involves weighing many factors. Local laws, someone's physical and mental health, and their personal beliefs and wishes all play a role. Euthanasia is when a doctor gives someone who is dying medication that will end their life. Some use the term assisted suicide, physician-assisted death, physician-assisted suicide, and mercy killing as synonyms for euthanasia. But legal and medical experts define this differently. Euthanasia is different than assisted suicide because with euthanasia, the doctor actually administers the medication that causes death. For example, a doctor may inject a dying person with drugs that will stop the heart. Usually, euthanasia happens in a hospital or medical facility. Types of euthanasia. Different practices fall under the label euthanasia. Here are some distinctions demarcating different versions. First is the active euthanasia, killing a patient by active means. For example, injecting a patient with a lethal dose of a drug, sometimes called aggressive euthanasia. Second is the passive euthanasia, intentionally letting a patient die by withholding artificial life support such as a ventilator or feeding tube. Some ethicists distinguish between withholding life support and withdrawing life support. The patient is on life support but then removed from it. Third is the voluntary euthanasia, or with the consent of the patient. Fourth is the involuntary euthanasia, without the consent of the patient. For example, if the patient is unconscious and his or her wishes are unknown. Some ethicists distinguish between involuntary or against the patient's wishes and non-voluntary, without the patient's consent but wishes are unknown forms.
Controversy around euthanasia. There are many arguments both for and against euthanasia and PAS. Most of these arguments fall into four main categories. First is the morality in religion. Some people believe euthanasia is murder and find it unacceptable for moral reasons. Many also argue that the ability to decide your own death weakens the sanctity of life. In addition, many churches, religious groups, and faith organizations argue against euthanasia for similar reasons. Second is the physician judgment. PAS is only legal if someone is mentally capable of making the choice. However, determining someone's mental capabilities is not very straightforward. One study found that doctors are not always capable of recognizing when someone is fit to make the decision. Third is the ethics. Some doctors and opponents of PAS are concerned about the ethical complications doctors could face. For more than 2,500 years, doctors have taken the Hippocratic Oath. This oath encourages doctors to care for and never harm those under their care. Some argue that the Hippocratic Oath supports PAS since it ends suffering and brings no more harm. On the other hand, some debate it results in harm to the person and their loved ones, who must watch their loved ones suffer. And lastly, the personal choice, death with dignity, is a movement that encourages legislatures to allow people to decide how they want to die. Some people simply don't want to go through a long dying process, often out of concern of the burden it puts on their loved ones.
Statistic of euthanasia. Euthanasia and assigned suicide rates around the world, according to a peer-reviewed paper published last year in the respect journal JAMA. Between 0.3% to 4.6% of all deaths are reported as euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and jurisdictions where they are legal. The frequency of these deaths increased after legalization. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are increasingly being legalized, remain relatively rare, and primarily involve patients with cancer. Existing data do not indicate widespread abuse of these practices. The author of the paper said that 35,598 people died in Oregon in 2015. Of these deaths, 132 or 0.39% were reported as physician-assisted suicides. The same paper said that in Washington in 2015 there were 166 reported cases of physician-assisted suicide, equivalent to 0.32% of all deaths in Washington in that year. By 2017, a Gallup poll found a large shift in attitude in the United States. Almost three-quarters of people survived support euthanasia. Another 67% said doctors should be allowed to assist patients with suicide. Interestingly, a study in the United Kingdom found that the majority of doctors weren't in favor of voluntary euthanasia and PAS. Their main objection was based on religious issue.
The ethical dilemma of euthanasia.
Euthanasia raises a number of agonizing moral dilemmas. Is it ever right to end the life of a terminally ill patient who is undergoing severe pain and suffering? Under what circumstances can euthanasia be justifiable, if at all? Is there a moral difference between killing someone and letting them die? Or does an individual who has no hope of recovery have the right to decide how and when to end their life? Heart of these arguments are the different ideas that people have about the meaning and value of human existence. Should human beings have the right to decide on issues of life and death? There are also a number of arguments based on particular issues. Some people think that euthanasia shouldn't be allowed, even if it was morally right, because it could be abused and used as a cover for murder.
Why people want euthanasia? Most people think unbearable pain is the main reason people seek euthanasia. But some surveys in the USA and the Netherlands showed that less than a third of requests for euthanasia were because of severe pain. Terminally ill people can have their quality of life severely damaged by physical conditions such as incontinence, nausea and vomiting, breathlessness, paralysis, and difficulty in swallowing. Psychological factors that cause people to think of euthanasia include depression, fearing loss of control or dignity, feeling a burden, or dislike of being dependent. Why euthanasia should be allowed? Those in favor of euthanasia argue that a civilized society should allow people to die in dignity and without pain, and should allow others to help them do so if they cannot manage it on their own. They say that our bodies are our own, and we should be allowed to do what we want with them. So it's wrong to make anyone live longer than they want. In fact, making people go on living when they don't want to violates their personal freedom and human rights. It's immoral, they say, to force people to continue living in suffering and pain. They add that a suicide is not a crime. Euthanasia should not be a crime.
Why euthanasia should be forbidden. Religious opponents of euthanasia believe that life is given by God, and only God should decide when to end it. Other opponents fear that if euthanasia was made legal, the laws regulating it would be abused, and people would be killed who didn't really want to die. When it comes to the legal position, euthanasia is illegal in most countries. Although doctors do sometimes carry out euthanasia even where it is illegal. Euthanasia is illegal in Britain. To kill another person deliberately is murder or manslaughter, even if the other person asks you to kill them. Anyone doing so could potentially face 14 years in prison. And under the 1961 Suicide Act, it is also a criminal offense in Britain, punishable by 14 years imprisonment, to assist, aid, or counsel somebody in relation to taking their own life. Nevertheless, the authorities may decide not to prosecute in cases of euthanasia after taking into account the circumstances of the death. Like in September 2009, the Director of Public Prosecutions was forced by an appeal to the House of Lords to make public the criteria that influence whether a person is prosecuted. The factors put a large emphasis on the suspect knowing the person who died and on the death being a one-off occurrence in order to avoid a prosecution.
Today's question is, what does the Bible say about euthanasia and assisted suicide? In this video, I'll answer that question from a biblical perspective. Afterwards, as always, I'll share some helpful resources, so stick around until the end. Euthanasia, sometimes called mercy killing, can be a difficult issue. On one hand, we do not want to take a person's life into our own hands and end it prematurely. On the other hand, we do not want to prolong the process of dying more than necessary. That is, we want to preserve life but not prolong death. At what point do we simply allow a person to die and take no further action to extend his or her life? A related issue is that of assisted suicide. Essentially, a person seeking assisted suicide is seeking to euthanize himself with the aid of another person to ensure that death is quick and painless. The person assisting the suicide facilitates death by making preparations and furnishing the needed equipment, but the person seeking death is the one who actually initiates the process. By taking a hands-off approach to the death itself, the facilitator seeks to avoid charges of murder. Proponents of assisted suicide try for a positive spin by using terms like death with dignity, but death with dignity is still death. Assisted suicide is still suicide, and suicide is wrong. We live in what is sometimes described as a culture of death. Abortion on demand has been practiced for decades. Now, some are seriously proposing infanticide. And euthanasia is promoted as a viable means of solving various social and financial problems. This focus on death as an answer to the world's problems is a total reversal of the biblical model. Death is an enemy, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 26. Life is a sacred gift from God, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. When given the choice between life and death, God told Israel to choose life, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. Euthanasia spurns the gift and embraces the curse. The overriding truth that God is sovereign drives us to the conclusion that euthanasia and assisted suicide are wrong. We know that physical death is inevitable for us mortals. However, God alone is sovereign over when and how a person's death occurs. Job testifies in Job chapter 30, verse 23, "I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living." Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 8 declares, "No man has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the day of his death." God has the final say over death. Euthanasia and assisted suicide are man's attempts to usurp that authority from God. Death is a natural occurrence. Sometimes God allows a person to suffer for a long time before death occurs. Other times, a person's suffering is cut short. No one enjoys suffering, but that does not make it right to determine that a person should die. Often, God's purposes are made known through suffering. When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider God has made the one as well as the other. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 14. Romans chapter 5, verse 3 teaches that tribulations bring about perseverance. God cares about those who cry out for death and wish to end their suffering. God gives purpose in life even to the end. Only God knows what is best, and His timing, even in the matter of one's death, is perfect. We should never seek to prematurely end a life, but neither must we go to extraordinary means to preserve a life. To actively hasten death is wrong. To passively withhold treatment can also be wrong. But to allow death to occur naturally in a terminally ill person is not necessarily wrong. Anyone facing this issue should pray to God for wisdom. James chapter 1, verse 5. And we should all remember the words of former Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who warned that the practice of medicine cannot be both our healer and our killer.
The ethical resolution of euthanasia. Christianity represents the coming together of the two distinctive streams of Greco-Roman and Jewish thought. Its Jewish inheritance invests in it an uncompromising belief in the sanctity of innocent life. Based on the doctrine of creation as the handiwork of a personal God, God who alone can give and take life away was the belief. What mattered at the end was not peace or dignity, but bowing to the will of God. The early church rejected euthanasia in every context, with some exceptions. Infanticide was prohibited, because all who are born, no matter what their physical structure was, had souls. Suicide was forbidden because one's life was viewed as a trust from God, and only God had the right to take it. The Christian view until the 16th century was, suffering, no matter how horrible or seemingly pointless, was considered burden imposed by God Himself, for purpose best known to him, which men and women must bear until natural end. Christian transmutation of suffering meant that there could be no justification for the killing of the person who was dying in pain. A lot of positions were subsequently modified regarding suicide and capital punishment, but the church opposition to euthanasia continued throughout the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, conflict exists among many groups and ethnicities today relating to the morality of euthanasia.